All right, so in this video, we're going to be talking about how to export things from Adobe Illustrator and get them into Xcode, the IDE for Swift 5 and for iOS development. So in this case, we have a bunch of different objects in our Illustrator file. These are just simple SVG graphics that I made. There's two different things. We could be exporting the entire artboard, right, which might be if we've made a background or an entire screen layout or an illustration or something, versus exporting the individual asset. And we're going to talk about how to do both of those from Illustrator today. Now, one of the most important things to know is that the human interface guidelines for Apple specify that all things should be created at three different sizes. You should have a 1x version of an image, a 2x version of an image, and a 3x version of an image. Those three versions of the same image are going to provide you with a variety of resolutions to display whenever you're scaling to different devices. So for example, using an iPhone X, which is the same dimensions as a 11 Pro, it's going to use essentially a higher resolution, or what's called a 3x image, versus a different type of phone, maybe like an XR, which is a lower resolution phone. I believe an XR uses a 2x resolution image. Now, luckily, that's easy to handle in Illustrator and XD, but I'm going to show you through that process. So the first thing we need to do is get really familiar with the File Export for Screens menu. This Export for Screens menu has two tabs in it. It has Artboards and Assets. Artboards is going to handle entire artboards, so entire screens basically worth of content. Now, it's a good idea to design your content using an actual screen dimension size. Whenever you go to create a new document in Illustrator, you can pick mobile as a preset category and then select iPhone X or something like that, iPhone 8 Plus, as your screen background, or as your artboard size. So with the artboard, the first artboard right here, if I had multiple, they would all appear here, and I can select them, which ones I want to export. And I'm going to choose where to export those to. So I just click this little folder. I'm going to use this art assets folder I've created. I'm going to do open location after export. I can include the bleed or not. So if I have bleed on this document, I can include that. And yeah, basically we're good to go. I need to uncheck this create subfolders. This will just make our lives a little bit easier. If I have this checked, then each of these formats that export are going to have their own individual folders, which just gives us an extra step, and we don't really want to do that. So I'm going to uncheck create subfolders, and then we have these options right here. So we can actually just pick iOS from this menu, and that will add the iOS presets here. Android will add all of the Android presets. We can give it a prefix, so a name here. I'm just giving it Pac-Man. Whatever you name your document or your artboard will also show up within that, but I'll just call it Pac-Man for now. And we have the scale, 1x, 2x, 3x. So it's going to scale this up and down based on the selection that you have. It's going to export 3 PNG files and 1 SVG file. So an SVG file is a vector graphic format, and these are bitmap images. PNGs have transparency, so we could overlay these on top of a background, whereas the SVG, which also has transparency, is really a vector graphic file. It has a different use case. If you don't need it, you can just remove it with the little X right there. We can change the settings here. We'll do 1x, 2x, 3x, and leave these suffixes with these @ symbols. So if I highlight over this, you can see down below where it says prefix Pac-Man, it says Pac-Man artboard name @3x.png. So that's what it's going to export. I'm going to go ahead and hit export artboard. It's going to run the little exporting script, and it opens it up, and look at this. I have 3 files. I have my 1x, my 2x, and my 3x exported and ready to go. So those are the entire artboards. How would I export just one of these? The best way to do that is to go to Window and then Asset Export. So this is its own little window. I actually like to let this guy kind of live down here. And with the Asset Export window, you just simply drag a graphic or a group of graphics. So if I wanted to do 2 of these, I could grab both of these, group them together, and then drag and drop them in here as one asset. So here I have 2 different assets. I have this asset here, I have this asset here, and it's the same thing. I can just set the iOS. I'll remove that SVG again. I'm not going to use it. And I can hit export, and it's going to do the same type of system where it will create our different files. Let's see. So it made asset 2, asset 2, asset 2 at 1x, 2x, and 3x. Let's select this one and export. We'll pick that same folder. I'll hit choose, and it exports those. So with all these images, the easiest way, and this is why we made sure we unchecked that create subfolders, to pull these into Xcode is quite simple. We can actually select them, and as long as they have this naming structure with these @ symbols, they should come in just fine. Let's go ahead and open up Xcode. I'm in my assets.xc assets folder over here in this left-hand side. Here's my app icon. I can simply drag and drop all of these into my XC assets, and it should automatically group them together. So you'll see it grouped asset 2, asset 3, and Pac-Man artboard all together. Now, I would really recommend naming your assets, because whenever we pull these into an actual project, which I'll do just really briefly, it can create problems. I'll go ahead and click this little plus, and I'll add an image view. I'll drop an image view in and have it selected, and then in my asset navigator or asset inspector, attribute inspector, can't talk today, I can select different images, and it can be a little tricky if you have a lot of assets, so give them different names. So I pick asset 2, boom, it's in, and we're good to go. It's going to scale automatically, and it'll work just fine. In Adobe XD, it's basically the same process, but even simpler. I go File, Export, All Artboards, and if I have one thing particularly selected, like one whole artboard, in that menu, it's going to pull up what am I exporting it for. I can say iOS. I can say it was designed at whatever scale. So if I'm using, this is an iPhone XS11 Pro, so that's going to be 3x. So I would pick the iOS designed at 3x and hit export all artboards. To do individual assets, I would have an asset selected in my asset window, or in the what is this called? This is also called the asset window. I can mark them for export. So there's polygon 1, 2, and 3. I can go File, Export Batch, and that will export anything labeled as marking for export. I say iOS. They were designed at 3x because I was using the iPhone X layout. I'll hit Export, same exact system, and now on my desktop I have that nice grouping, or wherever those saved. I think it's actually my documents, but a nice grouping of images that are good to go.